Welcome to the France 24 debate. I'm Annette Young. And we're down to the wire with Britain set to vote in a new government this Thursday. A Financial Times poll shows that British Conservatives and Labor are neck and neck at 34%. It suggests neither Prime Minister David Cameron or his Labor opponent, Ed Miliband, will win an outright majority. If this is the case, there's going to be much horse trading as the leading candidate seeks to form a coalition government. It also means very likely that Nicola Sturgeon, the head of the Scottish National Party, will become a king, or rather Queenmaker. Now, with me to discuss this is Professor Colin Hay from Sciences Po here in Paris. Thank you, Colin, for joining us. And France 24's Hala Moeddine, who's part of our team covering the election. She happens to be in the Scottish border village of Blainsley. Thanks to you, Hala, for joining us. But first, let's talk to Colin. The polls are showing the odds are in favour of a coalition having to be formed with no main party to win outright. Is everybody set to lose in this scenario?
Well, yeah, well, it is possibly even more complicated than you suggest, because I think we may well not see a coalition government emerge out of this. It's certainly the case that if the polls are anything like as you've just reported them, you were talking about 34% for the Conservatives, 34 points for Labour. If that were the case, then Labour or the Conservatives would have to form almost certainly a minority government rather than a formal coalition.
Well, it's certainly a lot of, horse trading is expected, isn't it? I mean, it's long gone are the days of a definite winner.
Certainly, the last two elections we haven't seen this. There's no way we're going to get a clear winner on Thursday, Friday morning. That's not going to happen. And so you're absolutely right that an awful lot of horse trading is going to go on, and it's not just going to go on in terms of the formation of the next administration. It's probably going to have to go on throughout the next parliamentary term as well, because during the campaign, in particular, Labour have been very clear that they won't form a coalition with the SNP, but if they were to form a government, they would have to do so with some kind of tacit support for the SNP, and that probably means negotiating deals on a week-by-week, month-by-month basis, and that's going to be very tough.
Hala Moeddine, you're in Blainsley. I would say it's safe to say that Scotland is playing a starring role in this election. What's the atmosphere like where you are in that tiny border village?
The atmosphere is quite subdued, really. No one's really sure what's going to happen. The constituency that I'm speaking from is usually a surefire bet that it'll return a Liberal Democrat MP. This constituency has been Liberal Democrat for over 50 years now, and now we're in a situation where it's a three-way tie between the Conservatives, the Liberal Democrats and the SNP, which is extraordinary given how conservative and restrained this constituency actually is. There's not the same level of expectation. There's not the same atmosphere gripping the country that there was during the referendum. But there is a general feeling that the referendum is continuing to influence what is happening in this election here.
And it certainly isn't the case that the Scottish voter has become a force to be reckoned with.
It is really. I mean, whichever way you look at the numbers, all roads do tend to lead back to Scotland, and that's exceptionally unusual in a general election. Scotland's normal role in a general election is to turn out 40 or 50 Labour MPs and send them down to Westminster. The old adage used to be you could put a monkey in a red rosette, in parts of Glasgow and the Central Belt, and it would still win for Labour. But because of this collapse in support for Scottish Labour, which has turned into a surge in support for the SNP, it's really thrown everything into question. It's changed the dynamic, not just of the election up in Scotland, but it will have repercussions across the UK. So whichever way you look at it, the way this election will be won depends on how Scotland votes.
And when you go out into the village and you talk to people there, what are they saying?
People tend to keep their cards quite close to their chest. It's certainly during the referendum, it would be, are you a yes, are you a no, because people really wanted to test out the arguments. One of the things so people don't really want to disclose who they're going to vote for, because it's very much a tactical game with this tight three-way race. But one thing which is very apparent, no matter who you talk to, is the fact that politicians, there is a collapse in trust amongst the electorate for the politicians. This is why we're seeing political sort of giants, almost like Douglas Alexander, across in Paisley, Margaret Curran in Glasgow, and even Michael Moore, who's the incumbent MP here, who was the Secretary of State for Scotland. He was part of the cabinet in this coalition government. He's lost the trust of this electorate, which is why we're seeing such a close vote. And it's the fact that the politicians of all stripes, really, who they simply...
At this point, because we seem to be having technical problems. Sorry, Hella, I'm just going to stop you there because we just seem to be losing your audio. So let me at this point just bring in Colin, because we're talking there about the fact that we're seeing a fragmented political landscape that we've never seen before in the UK. What does that say about the British voter?
Well, one of the things it says is that there is no longer a British voter, in a sense. That what we've just been hearing is that, in a sense, Scotland now is a different polity from the rest of the UK. And that's really, I mean, that's emerged recently. It's emerged after the Scottish independence referendum, and that's carried forward into this campaign. And in particular, what we saw during the Scottish independence referendum was, in a sense, the way in which the Westminster parties are no longer trusted in Scotland. So the SNP might not have won the independence referendum, but they did win the campaign, and they've carried that forward into the election, into this election campaign. And I mean, one poll was even suggesting they would win the entire 59 seats in Scotland. Now that almost certainly won't happen, but they're going to move to something in the region of 50, 53 seats out of 59. It's amazing.
But it's not just Scotland where you're in terms of a fragmented political landscape. It goes right across the board, and there's clearly a lot of issues at hand. There's voter apathy, isn't there?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's apathy, but there's voter distrust of politicians. That's manifest very clearly in Scotland in terms of the rise of SNP, but it's manifest in other parts of the UK too, with the rise in particular of UKIP. And one of the big questions for Thursday for the election itself will be how well UKIP do. They've been polling up to 15, 16, 17%, and it's been anticipated that actually they might lose a bit of that support in the last few days of the campaign. There's a little bit of evidence for that, but actually they will do much, much better than anyone probably thought they would have done a year out.
And one of the sort of images that's been mentioned in this campaign is the white van man, the sort of, you know, the working class male who is obviously very conservative in his viewpoints when it comes to immigration. And that has become a key market for those two leading parties, hasn't it?
That's right, and to some extent the issues around which that has occurred, as you rightly point out, partly is immigration, but also in some sense inequality too. And immigration in a context of inequality is creating this kind of fight between Labour and the Conservatives on a terrain defined a little bit by UKIP actually. So immigration, and also to some extent EU membership, and the link between EU membership and migration have become a kind of crucial issue in this election campaign, and one that won't go away on Thursday.
Let me bring in Hella Moyadeen at this point, and hopefully we can have no technical problems. Another person who's really come to the fore in this election campaign is Nicola Sturgeon. She really has become the star of this election, no doubt. In fact, the Scottish Sun on its front page just a few days ago depicted her as Princess Leia from Star Wars. I mean, and also to the point, I understand, Hella, that English voters have been coming up to Nicola Sturgeon saying, I wish I could vote for you.
That's certainly something which certainly came apparent after the strong performance she put in the leaders' debates, which were televised nationally. And the SNP's gain, and certainly Nicola Sturgeon, what she was trying to do was, in effect, portray the Scottish National Party not as the threat, which the Conservatives have been trying to paint her as, but to be more amenable to the rest of the population. So it's interesting you mentioned the Scottish Sun, because if you look at the English Sun, they've been doing quite the hatchet job on the Scottish National Party. There was one issue of the English Sun a few weeks ago where she was depicted in a bikini on a wrecking ball. So it depends on from which side of the equation you're coming at it. But certainly here in Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon is an incredibly popular politician. She's known by her first name alone. They talk about Nicola, and it's certainly very encouraging for women who want to get into politics as well. It's something that she's been very keen to encourage, is more female participation in the political sphere. She's wanting to put gender equality at the forefront. And this image is certainly endearing her to a lot of people. Certainly she's far more popular within Scotland itself than her predecessor, Alex Salmond.
And Colin, she's set to possibly become a king or queen maker.
Indeed, and in a sense, despite not standing in this election, she's a member of the Scottish Parliament, of course, so not standing here. But she's absolutely been integral to this campaign. Her rise to prominence will define in many respects what happens after the election, particularly if Labour has the opportunity to form a minority administration with her support.
And Hella, I mean, Nicola Sturgeon has been saying that Labor is not fit to govern Britain, that the two parties are effectively indistinguishable. I mean, in your opinion, from where you're standing, Hella, as far as the Scottish voter is concerned, is there any distinction between Labor and the Conservatives?
Well, the surge in SNP support suggests that a lot of voters simply don't see the difference between Labour and the Conservatives. That's certainly what's fueling the rise in SNP support. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, there has been a complete breakdown in trust between the electorate and the politicians that have been elected. And certainly Labour standing alongside the Conservative Party, campaigning against independence, has certainly damaged their standing here in Scotland amongst a large part of the population. There are some 180,000 Labour members who voted for independence, and a large chunk of them have now switched allegiance to the SNP since. But if you drill down into that message a bit closer, it's a very confusing picture, because in Scotland, the SNP are very keen to tell the electorate here that there is no difference between the Conservative Party and the Labour. They call Labour the Red Tories. But if you look at the message Nicola Sturgeon is trying to communicate to the rest of the UK, we'll put you in power, Ed Miliband. We want a Labour government. It's certainly from political analysts here in Scotland are looking at this message saying it's just completely incredible. It's so contradictory. And yet people in Scotland are still prepared to vote SNP. That shows how much the atmosphere here has changed.
Now, just translate that to the UK itself.
Well, I think it's fascinating, and I think what you see is actually two different messages from almost all of these parties in two different political contexts. So Nicola Sturgeon, south of the border, is talking about supporting a Labour administration in a sense, not forming a formal coalition because that's not what Labour wants, so the opportunity doesn't exist, but indicating that she will do anything she can to avoid the repeat of a Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition government. And yet north of the border, the parties south of the border are deemed as all the same, vote SNP, and you get the opportunity for something completely different. Similarly, I think it's Labour that's in the most difficult position here. Labour can't say what a Scottish Labour Party would probably wish to say to the electorate north of the border, because it threatens then to appear no longer the party of austerity and fiscal discipline and fiscal rectitude, which is what allows Nicola Sturgeon to say in the end that actually these two parties south of the border, Conservative and Labour, look remarkably similar.
It sounds like there really is a growing divide between Scotland and the rest of the UK, and that they're having to tailor their political campaigns quite differently.
I think that's right, and in some sense, we might anticipate that it might only get worse after the election. I mean, it's too early to say, because we just don't. This election is so close that we don't know who's going to emerge as the Prime Minister. But if, as the polls suggest at the moment, the most likely scenario is that it would be Labour, not the biggest party possibly, but it would have to rely on SNP support to some extent. That will make this what many people in England see as an unholy alliance between the Scottish nationalists and Labour, a constant issue of political contention in the next Parliament.
Well, certainly, as we've just been talking about, the British political landscape has changed dramatically in the last 5 or 10 years, which is why a lot of us in Europe are watching this campaign with fervent interest. Yet, interestingly enough, the word Europe has barely crossed the lips of either leading candidate.
Yeah. It has done a little bit in the last 2 days, but in a very specific way.
It's a hot button issue, though, isn't it?
No, absolutely it is. And it's a very interesting issue, because a key outcome of this election will be whether Britain has an in-out referendum on its EU membership. If on Thursday, Friday, actually it'll be after that, but if the next government happens to be a Cameron-led minority government or a Cameron-Clegg coalition once again, then we will almost certainly have an in-out referendum on EU membership. If, conversely, it's a Miliband-led minority Labour government with SNP support, then we won't have an in-out referendum on Europe. That's how crucial this issue is. But you're absolutely crucial. The parties haven't been talking about it. Why? The real reason, I think, is because the Conservatives who might benefit from making an issue of this fear that they're outflanked on this issue by UKIP, and so they've kept the lid on the EU issue in some sense throughout this campaign.
Hala, you just mentioned earlier there the issue of gender. Now, women make up 52% of the electorate. You've got a record number of candidates, women candidates in this election. Do you think, from where you're standing and taking a broader view beyond just Scotland, that there is such a thing as a women's vote in this election?
A women's vote, it's difficult to say, because people always talk about the women's issues and women, what will they vote on? I mean, the key fact is that women, the issues that affect women are the issues that affect the rest of the country as well. It's encouraging to see a lot more female candidates going into this election, but certainly here in Scotland, that's something that I think we're actually leading the UK on in terms of, if you look at the politicians who make up the Scottish Parliament, the cabinet is now gender neutral. All three leaders in the Scottish Parliament, the leaders of the three of the main parties, are women. The Scottish Conservatives are led by Ruth Davidson, who's very well respected here. Kezia Dugdale is leading the Scottish Labour Party in the Scottish Parliament. And of course, we have Nicola Sturgeon, who's making leaps and bounds in terms of increased opportunity for women.
We're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank my two guests. It's Professor Colin Hay from Sciences Po, and also France 24's very own Hala Moeddine, who's part of our British election team, and she'll be reporting on that incredible election in the next few days. Do stay with us here on France 24 for the second part of our debate.